With a desperate bid on waterlogged acreage that had her neighbors shaking their heads in pity, cattle rancher Elena Vasquez unknowingly purchased the final resting place of a Spanish treasure galleon that would transform her failing operation and challenge the grip of Louisiana's most powerful family. For beneath the murky waters and tangled cypress roots of what locals called Devil's Hollow lay a secret that had been deliberately hidden for over 3 centuries, protected by those who profited from keeping the past buried. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this tale of hidden treasure and small-town secrets captures your imagination, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have another extraordinary discovery waiting for you. The Louisiana sun beat down mercilessly on the auction grounds of Vermillion Parish as Elena Vasquez stood alone among clusters of well-dressed land developers and established ranchers. At 34, her calloused hands and sun-weathered face told the story of a woman who'd spent every waking hour fighting to save her family's cattle operation from bankruptcy. The foreclosure notices tucked in her truck's console gave her exactly 58 days before the bank would seize the Vasquez Ranch, a 180-acre spread that had been in her family since her great-grandfather immigrated from Mexico in the 1920s. Elena adjusted her faded baseball cap and tried to ignore the sideways glances from the other bidders. She knew what they saw: a struggling single mother in worn jeans and work boots, completely out of place among the pressed suits and polished cowboy boots of Vermillion Parish's elite. Her 10-year-old daughter Sophia was spending the day with Elena's mother, unaware that this auction might determine whether they'd have a home next month. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd as Lot 63 came up for bid, a 160-acre tract of marshy bottomland that had flooded regularly for as long as anyone could remember. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have the old Boudreaux wetlands featuring, well, plenty of water access," the auctioneer said with barely concealed amusement, drawing chuckles from the crowd. Everyone knew the land was worthless, too wet for cattle, too unstable for development, accessible only by a single dirt road that became a muddy nightmare during Louisiana's frequent storms. The property had been on the market for 3 years without a single serious inquiry. The starting bid was set at a laughably low $35,000, and even at that price, no hands went up. Elena had spent weeks researching this particular tract, though. Hidden in the parish records at the courthouse, she'd found references to successful rice farming on similar terrain in the 1800s, before some mysterious incident had caused the area to be abandoned. More importantly, she'd discovered that the land sat at the convergence of 3 natural waterways, meaning that with proper drainage, it could become prime grazing land for cattle that commanded premium prices due to their grass-fed status. The auction company's geological survey, buried in pages of fine print that most bidders never bothered to read, had noted significant soil density variations throughout the property, suggesting the presence of clay deposits that could be excavated and sold to construction companies. Elena had calculated that even modest clay extraction could generate enough revenue to fund a proper drainage system. But there was something else that had caught her attention during her research. A pattern in the old parish records that suggested the Montclair family, the wealthiest landowners in Vermillion Parish, had been quietly trying to acquire this specific tract for decades through various shell companies and intermediaries. Every attempt had failed due to legal complications involving the original Spanish land grants, but their persistent interest made her wonder what they knew that others didn't. "$35,000?" Elena called out, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. Every head turned toward her. She could see the mixture of pity and amusement in their faces, the way conversations paused as people registered that the broke rancher was about to make what they considered a catastrophic mistake. Behind her, she heard Celeste Montclair, the 40-something heiress to the parish's most powerful family, whisper loudly to her assistant, "Poor thing's about to buy herself the world's most expensive frog pond." The auctioneer looked around hopefully for competing bids, scanning the crowd of developers and investors who had shown interest in other properties throughout the day. But for this waterlogged tract, there were no takers. Going once, going twice. The gavel fell with finality. Sold to bidder 47 for $35,000. As Elena made her way to the payment table, her legs felt unsteady. She'd just spent money she couldn't afford on land that everyone considered worthless, gambling her daughter's future on a hunch based on century-old records and geological anomalies that might mean nothing. But as she passed a group of local ranchers who didn't bother to lower their voices, she kept her expression neutral. Vasquez finally cracked under the pressure. That swamp's been trouble since before my great-grandfather's time. The old Creole families used to say there were reasons folks abandoned that land, and those reasons haven't changed. Cursed is what it is, added Marie Boudreau, an elderly woman whose family had farmed the area for generations. My grandmother used to tell stories about that place, said something evil happened there long ago, something that turned the very ground sour. We don't even hunt those woods anymore. Nothing but quicksand and gators, laughed another rancher. At least you'll have plenty of water for her cattle, assuming they can swim.
Elena signed the papers with hands that trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the magnitude of what she just committed to. The land purchase had taken nearly all of her remaining savings, money she'd originally planned to use for winter feed and emergency veterinary expenses. Now she owned 160 acres of what everyone considered worthless swampland, and exactly 56 days to figure out how to make it generate enough income to save her ranch. Celeste Montclair approached as Elena finished the paperwork, gliding across the dusty auction ground in designer boots that probably cost more than Elena's monthly grocery budget. Despite being roughly the same age, Celeste looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Perfectly styled blonde hair, flawless makeup, and clothes that whispered expensive, even in their casual elegance. "Ms. Vasquez, isn't it?" Celeste extended a perfectly manicured hand with the practiced charm of someone born into Louisiana's aristocracy. "Celeste Montclair, I couldn't help but notice your interesting purchase today." Elena shook the offered hand warily. The Montclair family had owned vast holdings throughout the parish for over 2 centuries, including substantial interests in the bank that currently holds the mortgage on Elena's ranch. Their influence extended into local politics, business licensing, zoning decisions, and pretty much every aspect of economic life in Vermillion Parish. 3 generations of Montclairs had served as parish president, and the current holder of that office was Celeste's uncle. "Just saw an opportunity," Elena replied carefully, noting how Celeste's smile seemed to tighten slightly at the edges. Of course," Celeste nodded, but her blue eyes remained calculating. "I actually wanted to make you an offer. My family has historical connections to that particular tract of land. It borders some of our ancestral holdings, and we've been hoping to consolidate the area for conservation purposes. I'd be willing to buy it from you right now for $50,000, a $15,000 profit for 15 minutes of ownership. Quite generous for such a challenging piece of property, wouldn't you say?" The offer was substantial. Elena could use that extra money to extend her loan deadlines and buy precious time to restructure her ranch's finances. But something in Celeste's eagerness, the way her polished demeanor couldn't quite hide an underlying urgency, made her suspicious. Why would someone offer to pay 40% above the auction price for worthless swampland? And why approach her immediately, before she'd even had time to examine what she'd bought? "I appreciate the offer," Elena said slowly, studying Celeste's face, "but I think I'll see what I can do with it first. Maybe there's something there worth developing." Celeste's expression flickered for just a moment, revealing something harder beneath the polished surface, a flash of genuine concern, or perhaps frustration. "I do hope you reconsider, Ms. Vasquez. That land has a complicated history. It can be quite dangerous for someone unfamiliar with its particular challenges. Sinkholes, unstable ground, wildlife hazards. We've had incidents over the years." The words carried an undertone that made Elena's instincts prickle. Was that a warning born of genuine concern or something more calculated? The way Celeste's voice dropped slightly on the word incidents suggested there was more to the story than simple environmental hazards. "I'll keep that in mind," Elena replied directly. "I'd been dealing with difficult land my whole life. I'm sure I can handle whatever challenges come up." As Elena drove away from the auction in her battered pickup truck, she couldn't shake the feeling that her purchase had triggered something beyond simple amusement at her apparent foolishness. In her rearview mirror, she watched Celeste Montclair speaking intensely with several men in expensive suits, their heads bent together in what looked like urgent consultation. One of them was taking notes, while another was already on his phone, pacing back and forth with obvious agitation. The drive to her new property took Elena through the heart of Vermillion Parish's agricultural country, past sprawling plantations that had been converted to modern cattle operations and rice farms. The Montclair holdings stretched for miles along this route, pristine white fences marking boundaries that encompassed some of the most valuable agricultural land in southern Louisiana. Elena had always wondered how one family had managed to accumulate so much prime real estate over the centuries, especially given the complex history of Spanish and French colonial land grants in the region. As she turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to her newly purchased tract, Elena's truck began to bounce and lurch over ruts that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Spanish moss hung from massive oak trees on either side of the path, creating a tunnel-like canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and green. The air grew thick and humid as she approached the wetlands, carrying the rich sense of decomposing vegetation and stagnant water.
When Elena finally reached the end of the road, she parked on a small rise that offered the first clear view of her purchase. The land stretched before her, acres of standing water dotted with cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, their gnarled roots disappearing into murky depths that reflected the cloudy sky. Islands of higher ground created a patchwork of solid earth throughout the marsh, some supporting clusters of ancient oak trees, others covered in thick stands of marsh grass and cattails. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, but Elena could understand why everyone considered it worthless for agricultural purposes. The water levels seemed to vary dramatically across the property, from ankle-deep in some areas to what appeared to be several feet deep around the largest cypress stands. Getting cattle to graze here would require extensive drainage work and careful management of water flow. Elena stepped out of her truck and immediately sank ankle-deep into soft mud. The ground squelched beneath her boots as she made her way toward the water's edge, trying to get a sense of the property's topography and drainage patterns. According to the Geological Survey, the underlying clay layer was relatively shallow throughout most of the tract, which should make drainage feasible if she could afford the equipment rental. But as she stood there in the growing twilight, Elena began to understand why the local family spoke of this place with superstitious dread. There was something unsettling about the silence. No bird calls, no insect sounds, just the gentle lapping of water against cypress roots and the distant splash of what might have been an alligator or simply a falling branch. The Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze like ghostly curtains, and shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. Elena shook off the creeping unease and focused on practical matters. She needed to survey the entire property, identify the best locations for drainage channels, and develop a realistic timeline for making the land productive. But as darkness began to fall over the Louisiana Bayou country, she decided to return in the morning with proper equipment and daylight to guide her exploration. Her phone buzzed as she reached her truck. A text message from an unknown number. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. Smart people know when to walk away. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, her pulse quickening. The timing was too coincidental to be random. Someone had been watching her, someone who knew about her land purchase and wanted to discourage her from developing it. She deleted the message, but made a mental note to be more cautious about sharing her plans with anyone in the community. As she drove home through the darkening countryside, Elena passed a historical marker she'd never really noticed before. Montclair Landing, established 1742, where French colonial Louisiana began its golden age. The date stuck in her mind.
1742. According to the parish records she'd researched, that was the same year that something catastrophic had happened in the wetlands, something that had driven away the original Acadian settlers and left the land abandoned for decades. But those were just stories, passed down through families who'd learned not to ask too many questions about how certain fortunes had been built during Louisiana's colonial period. Elena had more immediate concerns, like figuring out how to turn 160 acres of swampland into something that could save her ranch and secure her daughter's future. Back at the modest ranch house she had inherited from her father, Elena found Sophia doing homework at the kitchen table while her mother, Carmen, prepared dinner. At 72, Carmen Vasquez still possessed the sharp wit and unwavering determination that had helped her survive decades of agricultural uncertainty. But Elena could see the worry lines that had deepened over the past year as their financial situation deteriorated. "How did it go, mija?" Carmen asked without looking up from the stove. "Did you find something we can afford?" "I bought the old Boudreaux wetlands, 160 acres for $35,000. Carmen's wooden spoon clattered against the pot. "Elena, no, not that place. Your father told me stories about that land, stories his grandfather passed down. Something terrible happened there long ago." "Abuela, what kind of terrible thing?" "Just old tales, nieta. But sometimes old tales carry warnings we should heed." After Sophia went to bed, Elena and her mother sat on the front porch discussing the day's events in hushed tones. The ranch stretched out before them in the moonlight, modest but well-maintained, representing 4 generations of hard work and careful stewardship. Elena's great-grandfather had built the original house with his own hands, expanding it room by room as the family grew and prospered. Now it might all be lost because Elena couldn't generate enough income to service the debt her father had accumulated during his final illness. "Tell me about the stories," Elena said. "What did Papa's grandfather really say about that land?" Carmen rocked slowly in her chair, choosing her words carefully. "He said that in 1742, a great ship came up the bayou during a terrible storm. Spanish sailors carrying treasure from the New World back to their king. But they never made it home. The ship vanished, and with it, men who knew secrets that certain families wanted kept buried." "That's just folklore, Mama. Ships don't vanish without a trace."
"Perhaps," Carmen nodded. "But your great-great-grandfather also said that the Montclair family built their fortune very quickly after 1742, acquiring land and influence far beyond what their original French colonial grant should have provided. He always wondered where such sudden wealth had come from." Elena considered this information. If there was any truth to the family stories, it would explain why the Montclairs had been so persistent in trying to acquire the wetlands over the years, and why Celeste had approached her so quickly with such a generous offer. But treasure ships and colonial conspiracies seemed far less likely than simple clay deposits and drainage opportunities. "I'm going to start surveying the property tomorrow," Elena said. "Whatever's out there, I need to understand what I'm working with." Carmen reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Just be careful, mija. Some families in this parish have very long memories, and they don't like it when people ask questions about the old days." That night, Elena lay awake thinking about geological surveys, drainage systems, and century-old mysteries. Outside her window, the sounds of the rural Louisiana night created a familiar symphony: crickets, tree frogs, and the distant call of a night heron. But underlying it all was the memory of the unnatural silence that had surrounded her new property, as if the land itself was holding its breath. She had no idea that her seemingly desperate gamble on worthless swampland had just made her the biggest threat to the most powerful family in Vermillion Parish, or that beneath the murky waters of Devil's Hollow lay the preserved remains of the Spanish treasure ship Esperanza del Sol, which had vanished during a hurricane in 1742 while carrying a fortune in gold and silver that had funded the Montclair family's rise to power for over 2 centuries. As Elena finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of Spanish moss and cypress trees, of shadows moving beneath dark water,
and of secrets that had been waiting 3 centuries for someone brave enough or desperate enough to uncover them. Tomorrow would bring the first steps of a journey that would transform not just her failing ranch, but the entire understanding of how Vermillion Parish's elite families had built their dynasties. The poor rancher who had been laughed at for buying worthless swampland was about to discover that some bargains come with mysteries attached, and some mysteries are worth more than anyone could imagine. Elena awoke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against her bedroom window. Louisiana storms could turn dirt roads into impassable mud traps, but she was determined to begin surveying her property despite the weather. After checking on Sophia, who was still sleeping peacefully, Elena gathered her equipment: waterproofed boots, surveying tools borrowed from her neighbor, a metal detector she'd bought years ago for treasure hunting with her father, and a waterproof bag containing copies of all the historical documents she'd uncovered during her research. The drive to Devil's Hollow took longer than expected due to the rain-slicked roads, but as she approached her property, she noticed something odd. Fresh tire tracks led to and from the access road, multiple vehicles by the look of it, and recent enough that the rain hadn't completely washed them away. Someone had been visiting her land, possibly during the night. Elena parked at the same spot as the day before and stepped out into the misty morning air. The rain had stopped, but everything dripped with moisture, and the humid atmosphere made the Spanish moss hanging from the oak trees look even more ghostly. As she made her way toward the wetlands, Elena noticed something that made her pause. Wooden stakes had been driven into the ground at regular intervals, marking what appeared to be a survey grid across her property. "What the hell?" she muttered, examining one of the stakes more closely. It was fresh pine, probably installed within the last 24 hours, and marked with spray-painted numbers that suggested a professional surveying operation. Someone had been mapping her land without permission, and they'd done it quickly and quietly. Elena pulled out her phone to photograph the evidence, but discovered she had no cell signal this deep in the wetlands. She made mental notes of the stake locations and continued toward the water's edge, her unease growing with each step. The silence she had noticed yesterday seemed even more pronounced this morning, as if the land itself was holding its breath. At the water's edge, Elena began her systematic exploration of the property boundaries. The geological survey had indicated that the underlying clay layer was relatively shallow, but as she probed with a metal rod, she discovered something unexpected. In several locations, particularly near the center of the wetlands, her probe struck something harder and more regular in shape than at depths that didn't match the survey data. Not clay, but something harder and more regular in shape. Elena's pulse quickened as she considered the implications. This wasn't random debris or discarded farm equipment. The object was too large, too regularly shaped, and positioned in a location that suggested it had been here for a very long time. According to her research, this area had been underwater almost continuously since the 1740s, when some unknown event had caused the local water table to rise dramatically. As she was taking measurements and photographs, Elena heard the sound of vehicles approaching along the access road. Multiple engines moving slowly and deliberately toward her property. She quickly gathered her equipment and moved behind the massive cypress tree, using its broad trunk to conceal herself while maintaining a view of the access road. 3 black SUVs emerged from the tree line, followed by a white van with Montclair Environmental Services painted on its side. Elena watched as nearly a dozen people emerged from the vehicles, including Celeste Montclair, who was now dressed in expensive outdoor gear that probably cost more than Elena's monthly mortgage payment. "The readings are definitely stronger today," one of the men was saying, as the group approached the water's edge. Elena recognized him as Dr. Marcus Benoit, a geologist who taught at Louisiana State University and occasionally consulted for private companies. "The storm last night may have shifted some of the sediment layers." "How much longer before we can bring in the heavy equipment?" Celeste asked, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. That depends on several factors. We need to complete the magnetometer survey to map the full extent of the anomaly. Based on preliminary readings, we're looking at something substantially larger than we initially estimated. The metallic mass extends across approximately 3 acres of the wetlands floor. Elena's breath caught. They were conducting their own survey of her property, using sophisticated equipment to map whatever was buried beneath the water. This wasn't a casual investigation. This was a major operation that had clearly been planned for some time. "What about the legal situation?" asked another man, whom Elena didn't recognize. "The Vasquez woman refused our initial offer." "That's being handled," Celeste replied coolly. "We have several options for acquiring the property through alternative means: eminent domain, environmental concerns, zoning violations. My uncle's position as parish president provides certain opportunities." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. They were planning to steal her land through legal manipulation, using their political connections to bypass her property rights. But why? What could possibly be worth such an elaborate conspiracy? "The historical research confirms our family records. The Esperanza del Sol was carrying the annual treasure fleet's consolidated cargo when it disappeared during the hurricane of 1742. Gold, silver, precious stones, and religious artifacts from 3 years of colonial taxation across New Spain. Conservative estimates place the value at over $200 million in today's market." Elena nearly gasped aloud. A Spanish treasure ship worth $200 million buried beneath the waters of her swampland. The family stories her mother had shared weren't folklore, they were historical fact. And the Montclair family had known about it for over 2 centuries. "My ancestor Pierre Montclair was the only survivor," Celeste said, her voice ticking on a reverent tone. "He spent his entire life searching for the ship, but the hurricane had changed the landscape so dramatically that he could never relocate it. The family has been looking for it ever since." "Actually," Dr. Benoit corrected gently, "based on the documentation we've uncovered, I believe Pierre Montclair may have found the ship shortly after the storm. The timing of his sudden wealth acquisition, the specific land purchases he made in this area, and certain entries in his personal journal all suggest that he located and partially salvaged the Esperanza del Sol. The question is why he left so much treasure behind." "Because he couldn't move at all without attracting attention," the unidentified man suggested. "Spanish colonial authorities were still active in the region. If they discovered that a French colonist had salvaged their treasure ship, it would have meant war between the settlements." Elena listened in fascination as the group discussed theories about why the treasure had remained buried for so long. According to their research, Pierre Montclair had taken only enough gold to establish his family's initial fortune, then deliberately flooded the area to conceal the ship's location from Spanish investigators. He'd intended to return for the rest of the treasure once the political situation stabilized, but had died unexpectedly before he could complete the salvage operation. "The irony," Dr. Benoit noted, "is that the flooding he created to hide the ship also preserved it perfectly. The anaerobic conditions in the swamp prevented the wooden hull from rotting, and the thick layer of sediment protected the metal components from corrosion. It's essentially a time capsule from the height of Spanish colonial power." Elena's mind raced as she processed this information. Her seemingly worthless swampland contained one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history, along with a fortune that would solve her financial problems for multiple lifetimes. But the Montclair family considered it rightfully theirs, and they clearly had the resources and political connections to take it from her. "When can we begin the extraction process?"
"That's where we encounter complications," Dr. Benoit replied. "This site falls under both state archaeological protection laws and federal maritime salvage regulations. Any excavation will require permits from multiple agencies, environmental impact studies, and oversight from the State Historic Preservation Office. The process could take years." "Unless we own the property outright," Celeste pointed out. "Private landowners have significantly more latitude in developing their holdings, especially for agricultural purposes. Drainage and land improvement projects rarely require the same level of oversight." "Which brings us back to the Vasquez problem," the unidentified man said. "She needs to be convinced to sell one way or another." Elena had heard enough. She began moving carefully through the cypress trees, staying low and using the thick vegetation as cover. She needed to reach her truck and get this information to someone who could help her. But who? If the Montclairs controlled local politics and had connections throughout the state government, traditional legal channels might not be sufficient. As Elena reached the edge of the tree line, Elena's boot caught on a submerged root, sending her stumbling forward with a splash that echoed across the still water. The conversation near the shore immediately stopped. "What was that?" Celeste's voice carried a sharp edge of suspicion. "Probably just an alligator," Dr. Benoit suggested, but Elena could hear movement as the group began investigating the sound. Elena abandoned stealth and ran for her truck, her boots splashing through puddles and mud as she crashed through the undergrowth. Behind her, she could hear voices calling out and the sound of pursuit. But she had a head start and knew the terrain better than her pursuers. She reached her truck and gunned the engine, spinning her tires in the mud before gaining traction. As she sped down the access road, Elena glimpsed figures emerging from the tree line in her rearview mirror, but they were too far away to identify her vehicle or see her license plate clearly. Elena's hands shook as she drove toward town, her mind reeling with the implications of what she'd discovered. She owned land containing a $200 million treasure, but powerful forces were already moving to take it from her. She needed allies, legal protection, and most importantly, she needed to secure evidence of her discovery before the Montclairs could implement whatever scheme they were planning. Her first stop was the Vermillion Parish courthouse, where she spent the next several hours in the records office, copying every document she could find related to the historical ownership of her property. The elderly clerk, Mrs. Robichaud, proved surprisingly helpful when Elena explained she was researching her family's connection to the area. "Oh yes, the old Boudreaux wetlands," Mrs. Robichaud nodded. "Lots of folks have asked about those records over the years. The Montclair family sent researchers here regularly, always wanting copies of the Spanish colonial land grants and the original survey maps from the 1740s. "Did they find what they were looking for?" Elena asked casually. "Hard to say," Mrs. Robichaud replied, lowering her voice. "But I always thought it was strange how interested they were in land that everyone knows is worthless. Makes a person wonder what they knew that others didn't." Elena spent the afternoon photographing documents and making notes. The historical record painted a fascinating picture of the early colonial period in Louisiana, when Spanish, French, and English interests competed for control of the lucrative Gulf Coast trade routes. The Esperanza del Sol had been part of an annual treasure fleet that transported wealth from Spanish colonies back to Europe. But the 1742 hurricane season had been particularly devastating, claiming several ships along the Gulf Coast. Most intriguingly, Elena discovered a series of letters from Spanish colonial administrators to their superiors in Havana, describing their frantic search for the missing treasure ship. The letters, written in formal Spanish and translated by some long-dead academic, indicated that the ship had been carrying far more than the typical colonial taxes. It had also been transporting a special cargo of religious artifacts and personal treasures belonging to high-ranking Spanish officials who were returning to Europe. "This could be the discovery of the century," Elena murmured, photographing a particularly detailed inventory of the ship's cargo. Gold chalices, silver plate, emerald jewelry, and art objects that would be priceless from both historical and monetary perspectives. As evening approached, Elena realized she needed professional help. She drove to Louisiana State University, hoping to find someone in the history or archaeology departments who could provide guidance on protecting her discovery and her rights as a property owner. The campus was largely deserted due to summer break, but she managed to locate Dr. Sarah Tron, an assistant professor of maritime archaeology who was working late in her office. Dr. Tron listened with growing excitement as Elena described her discovery and the events of the morning. When Elena showed her the photographs of the historical documents, Dr. Tron's eyes widened with amazement. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Tron said, studying the images on Elena's phone. "If this ship is really the Esperanza del Sol, it would represent one of the most significant archaeological finds in North American history. The preservation conditions you describe could provide unprecedented insights into Spanish colonial maritime culture. What are my rights as the property owner? Can the Montclair family really take this away from me through legal manipulation?
Dr. Tran frowned thoughtfully. That's complicated. Louisiana has some of the most complex property laws in the country due to our civil law heritage from French and Spanish colonial periods. Maritime salvage law adds another layer of complexity, and if there are historical preservation issues involved, she shook her head, you're going to need specialized legal representation. I don't have money for expensive lawyers, Elena admitted. My ranch is already facing foreclosure. Let me make some calls, Dr. Tran offered. There are organizations that protect archaeological sites and property rights. The State Historic Preservation Office might be able to provide assistance, and there are federal agencies that deal with maritime archaeology. If this discovery is as significant as it appears, you might find more support than you expect. Elena felt a surge of hope for the first time since discovering the Montclair conspiracy. Perhaps she wasn't as helpless as she'd feared, but as she drove home through the gathering darkness, her phone buzzed with another anonymous text message. You're making dangerous enemies. Some secrets have been kept safe for 3 centuries. Don't be the one to change that. This time, Elena didn't delete the message. Instead, she forwarded it to Dr. Tran along with a detailed account of everything she'd witnessed that morning. If the Montclairs wanted to play intimidation games, Elena was determined to ensure that others knew about their threats. At home, Elena found Sophia doing homework while Carmen prepared dinner. She tried to maintain a normal facade for her daughter's sake, but her mother's sharp eyes missed nothing. "What happened today, Mejia?" Carmen asked quietly after Sophia had gone to bed. "You look like you've seen ghosts." Elena described the day's discoveries, watching her mother's expression shift from concern to amazement to deep worry. When she finished, Carmen sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. "Your great-great-grandfather was right. There really was a treasure ship, and the Montclair family really did build their fortune on Spanish gold. But Elena, this makes you very dangerous to very powerful people. They've kept this secret for almost 300 years. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect it." "What choice do I have?" Elena asked. "If I walk away, I lose the ranch anyway. At least this way I have a chance to save everything and maybe uncover the truth about our family's history." Carmen reached across the table and grasped her daughter's hands. "Then we fight, but we fight smart. Your great-great-grandfather taught his children to be careful about powerful families with long memories. He also taught them to keep detailed records of everything just in case." That night, Elena sat at her laptop, documenting everything she'd learned and experienced. She created multiple backup copies of all the historical documents and photographs, storing them in different locations and sending copies to Dr. Tran. If something happened to her, others would know the truth about the Esperanza del Sol and the Montclair family's 3-century secret. As she worked, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Twice, she thought she saw headlights on the road leading to her ranch, vehicles that slowed as they passed but never stopped. The anonymous text messages had made it clear that her activities were being monitored, but she was determined not to be intimidated. Outside her window, the Louisiana night was alive with its usual symphony of sounds: crickets, tree frogs, and the distant call of night herons from the wetlands. But tonight, those sounds felt different, charged with the electricity of secrets about to be revealed and conflicts about to begin. Elena Vasquez had started the day as a struggling rancher who'd made what everyone considered a foolish land purchase. She was ending it as the owner of one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in American history, and as the target of a powerful family that would stop at nothing to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. The poor rancher who'd been laughed at for buying worthless swampland was about to discover that some treasures are worth fighting for, and some fights are more than money. They're about justice, truth, and the courage to challenge those who believe their power makes them untouchable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new revelations, as Elena began the process of turning her discovery into legal protection and financial salvation. But tonight, as she finally closed her laptop and prepared for bed, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Beneath the murky waters of Devil's Hollow, the Esperanza del Sol waited in its watery grave, its treasure holds filled with gold and silver that had funded a family's rise to power and maintained their influence for nearly 3 centuries. But now, a determined woman with nothing left to lose was about to change the course of history in Vermillion Parish one way or another. Before we continue with this incredible story, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this tale of hidden treasure and powerful secrets has captured your attention, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we have even more shocking revelations waiting for you. The battle for the treasure of the Esperanza del Sol was just beginning, and Elena Vasquez was about to learn that sometimes the most valuable discoveries come with the highest price.
Elena woke at 4:30 a.m. to the sound of her phone ringing insistently. Dr. Sarah Tron's voice was urgent when Elena answered. "Elena, you need to get to your property immediately. I've been monitoring emergency radio frequencies, and there's been some kind of incident at Devil's Hollow. Multiple sheriff's vehicles and what sounds like a hazmat team." Elena's blood ran cold. "What kind of incident?" "I'm not sure, but I heard mentions of environmental contamination and immediate area evacuation. This could be their move to seize your land through emergency powers." Elena was already pulling on her clothes. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. "Wait," Dr. Tron said. "Don't go alone. I've been making calls since yesterday evening, and I found some people who want to help. Can you meet us at the parish courthouse first? There are things you need to know before you confront whatever's happening at your property." An hour later, Elena found herself in the courthouse parking lot facing a group of people she'd never expected to see together. Dr. Tron had brought Dr. Rebecca Laurent, a maritime law attorney from New Orleans, who specialized in underwater archaeology cases. Standing beside them was Miguel Santos, a federal investigator from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Maria Boudreau, the elderly Creole woman whose family had farmed the area for generations. "Mrs. Boudreau asked to speak with you," Dr. Tron explained. "She has information about your property that goes back further than any official records." Maria Boudreau stepped forward, her weathered face serious. "My great-great-grandmother was there the night the Spanish ship came up the bayou," she said in accented English. "She was just a child, but she never forgot. The Montclair family, they didn't find that ship by accident. They knew exactly where it was because they helped sink it." Elena stared at the elderly woman. "What do you mean, help sink it?" "The hurricane of 1742 drove the Esperanza del Sol up Bayou Tachi looking for shelter, but Pierre Montclair and his men, they saw opportunity. They attacked the ship, killed most of the crew, and deliberately scuttled it in the shallow water. Then they told the Spanish authorities that the ship had been lost in the storm." Dr. Laurent, the maritime law attorney, leaned forward intently. "That would change everything legally. If the ship was deliberately sunk during an act of piracy, it doesn't qualify for traditional salvage rights. It would be classified as a crime scene, and any treasure recovered would be considered proceeds of a violent crime. My family kept the secret for almost 300 years, but we also kept proof." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small wooden box, its surface carved with intricate symbols. "This belonged to the ship's captain. My ancestor took it from the wreck before the Montclairs could find it." Inside the box was a letter-bound journal written in Spanish, its pages still legible despite their age. Dr. Tron photographed several pages, while Dr. Laurent examined the binding in paper quality. "This appears authentic," Dr. Laurent said. "If we can verify the provenance and get it translated, this could provide crucial evidence about what really happened in 1742. Miguel Santos, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Based on what you've told me, this situation involves potential federal crimes dating back centuries, environmental fraud in the present day, and the illegal seizure of private property. I think it's time we visited your land to see exactly what the Montclair family is trying to hide." The convoy of vehicles that arrived at Devil's Hollow an hour later created quite the spectacle. Elena led the way in her pickup truck, followed by Dr. Tron's university vehicle, Dr. Laurent's rental car, and Santos's federal government SUV. As they approached the access road, they encountered a sheriff's deputy who attempted to block their passage.
"Roads closed due to environmental hazard," the deputy announced, but his confidence wavered when Santos displayed his federal credentials. "Federal maritime investigation," Santos replied calmly, "will need access to the entire property." Elena could see her wetlands in the distance, now surrounded by temporary fencing and warning signs declaring danger, toxic contamination, authorized personnel only. Several white vans and a large truck with drilling equipment were positioned around the water's edge, while workers in hazmat suits moved purposefully through the area. "That's not a cleanup operation," Dr. Tron observed, studying the scene through binoculars. "That's an excavation. They're using the environmental emergency as cover to extract the treasure." Santos immediately got on his radio, calling for backup from federal environmental protection agencies. Within minutes, he had confirmed that no legitimate environmental emergency had been reported to any federal agency, meaning the entire operation was unauthorized. "We need to stop them now," Elena said, her anger overriding her caution. "They're stealing 3 centuries of history, not to mention $200 million in treasure." "Careful," Dr. Laurent warned. "We need to do this legally, or anything we discover could be thrown out in court." Santos coordinated with his federal contacts while the group documented the illegal excavation from a distance. Elena used her phone to record everything, creating a permanent record of the Montclair family's attempt to steal her property through fraudulent means.
As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from one of the white vans. Celeste Montclair, now dressed in a business suit despite the swampy conditions, was directing the operation with obvious urgency. She appeared to be arguing with Dr. Marcus Benoit, who was pointing toward the water and shaking his head emphatically. "They found something," Dr. Tran said, adjusting her binoculars. "Look at how excited everyone's getting." Indeed, the workers around the drilling equipment had begun moving with increased urgency. Elena could see them pulling up sections of what appeared to be wooden planking, dark with age but remarkably well preserved. Even from a distance, the material looked like it could be the hull of an ancient ship. "That's it," Elena breathed. "That's the Esperanza del Sol." Miguel Santos's radio crackled with an update from his federal contacts. "Environmental Protection Agency has no record of any contamination at this location. Fish and Wildlife Service confirms no permits issued for excavation work. This entire operation is illegal." Within the hour, federal agents had arrived to shut down the unauthorized excavation. Elena watched with satisfaction as Celeste Montclair's carefully orchestrated treasure hunt was halted by men and women in official windbreakers who began sealing evidence and questioning the workers. But the victory felt premature when Elena's phone rang with a call from her ranch. Sophia's frightened voice filled her with immediate dread. "Mama, there are men here asking about you. Abuela told me to hide in the barn and call you. They say they're from the bank, but they don't look like bank people." Elena's heart pounded. "Where's Abuela now?" "She's talking to them on the porch. She told them you weren't home, but they said they'd wait." Elena looked at her new allies with desperation. "They're threatening my family. I have to go." "Not alone," Dr. Laurent said firmly. "If they're escalating to intimidation tactics, you need witnesses and protection." The drive back to Elena's ranch felt endless, even with Santos's federal SUV providing escort. Elena's mind raced with worst-case scenarios involving her daughter and mother facing down Montclair enforcers. But when they arrived, they found an unexpected scene. Carmen Vasquez stood on the front porch facing 3 men in business suits. But she wasn't alone. At least a dozen neighbors had gathered in the yard, other ranchers, local business owners, and community members who had apparently rallied to support the Vasquez family. Elena recognized several faces from Sophia's school events and local agricultural meetings. "Elena," called out Tom Guidry, who owned a neighboring cattle operation. "These fellas showed up claiming you'd defaulted on some loan, but when we checked with the bank, they said no such thing was true." One of the men in suits, clearly frustrated by the unexpected community response, approached Elena's truck as she parked. "Ms. Vasquez, we need to discuss your financial obligations and certain irregularities in your recent land purchase." Santos stepped out of his vehicle, federal credentials prominently displayed.
"And you are?" The man's confidence visibly deflated. "Private investigators hired by concerned parties in the community." "Well, this concerned federal agent would like to see your licenses and hear about these alleged irregularities," Santos replied coolly. Dr. Laurent emerged from her car with a briefcase full of legal documents. "I'm Miss Vasquez's attorney. Any further communications regarding her financial or legal affairs should be directed through me." Elena felt a surge of gratitude for these people who had materialized to help her fight a battle she thought she would face alone. But she also recognized that the Montclair family's escalation meant the real conflict was just beginning. Sophia ran from the barn into Elena's arms, and Carmen approached with an expression of grim satisfaction. "I called everyone I could think of when those men showed up. Word travels fast in a community when people feel like outsiders are trying to push around one of their own." Tom Guidry overheard and nodded emphatically. "Elena, we've all heard rumors about what you found on that swampland. If there's really treasure out there, and if it can help save family farms like yours, then we want to help you keep it out of the hands of people who already have too much." Over the next several hours, Elena's ranch became an informal headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a community-wide effort to protect her discovery and her rights. Neighbors brought food, coffee, and most importantly, their own stories about the Montclair family's business practices over the years. They've been buying up small farms for decades, always through shell companies, always pressuring people during financial difficulties. Half of the agricultural land in the parish has ended up in their portfolio somehow. My grandfather lost his dairy operation to them in the 1980s. Same pattern, financial pressure, then a buyout offer that seemed generous until you realized you were selling for half what the land was really worth. Dr. Tran, the archaeologist, had been documenting these testimonies, recognizing their potential legal significance. "This establishes a pattern of predatory business practices," she told Dr. Laurent. "Combined with the historical evidence of piracy and the current attempt at illegal excavation, we're building a strong case."
Strategy. The illegal excavation had been halted, but the Montclair family's resources meant they would likely attempt other approaches to seizing the treasure. "They'll go after you through the courts next," Dr. Laurent predicted. "Expect lawsuits challenging your property ownership, environmental claims about the dangers of excavation, maybe even attempts to have the land declared archaeologically significant and seized for public research." "Can they do that?" Elena asked. "They can try," Santos replied. "But now that federal agencies are involved, they'll have to follow proper procedures. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management has jurisdiction over underwater archaeological sites, and the EPA will require genuine environmental impact studies for any excavation." Maria Boudreau, who had remained quietly observant throughout the day's events, finally spoke up. "There's something else you need to know about that treasure ship. My great-great-grandmother said the Spanish captain had a daughter aboard, a young woman who survived the attack and escaped into the swamps. She lived with the Acadian families for several years before disappearing. Some say she took secrets with her, maps, documents, maybe even some of the treasure." Elena felt a chill of recognition. "What was her name?" "Elena," Maria said with a slight smile. "Elena Esperanza Valdez. My family always said she was touched by the spirits of the bayou, that she could find things that were lost and hide things that needed protection." The coincidence of names sent murmurs around the table, but Elena was processing something more significant. During her research, she'd found references to an Elena's cache in some of the old Spanish documents, but had assumed it was a geographical feature or perhaps a mistranslation. "You think there might be additional treasure hidden separately from the ship?" Dr. Tran asked. "It's possible," Maria nodded. "The stories say Elena Valdez spent years collecting evidence of what happened, preparing for the day when justice could be served. She may have hidden documents, gold, or other proof in locations only her descendants would know about." Carmen had been listening intently, and now her expression showed sudden recognition.
Elena, remember the old well behind our house? The one your father always said was sealed for safety reasons? Elena's pulse quickened. The abandoned well had been a fixture of her childhood, covered by a heavy wooden lid that her father had warned her never to remove. She'd always assumed it had been sealed because of safety concerns about the depth or water quality. What are you thinking, Mama? Your father's family came here in the early 1900s, but before that, this land belonged to an Acadian family named Valdez. They lost the property during one of the yellow fever epidemics, and it was eventually sold to your great-grandfather. What if that well isn't just a well? Dr. Laurent was already reaching for her briefcase. We need to research the property records for this ranch, see if there are any historical connections to the Spanish survivor story. Santos held up a hand. Before anyone starts digging up wells, we need to consider legal implications. If there are additional archaeological artifacts on this property, disturbing them without proper permits could create problems. Elena understood the caution, but she also felt the urgency of their situation. The Montclair family had centuries of experience in hiding their crimes and manipulating legal systems. Every delay gave them more time to marshal their resources and find new ways to attack. What if we just examine the well without disturbing anything? Use cameras, ground-penetrating radar, the same techniques they were using at the swamp. Dr. Tran nodded enthusiastically. I have access to equipment through the university. We could do a non-invasive survey that would tell us if there's anything unusual below ground. Tom Guidry, who had been listening to the conversation with growing excitement, spoke up. Elena, if you're going to take on the Montclair family, you're going to need all the support you can get. What can the rest of us do to help? Elena looked around the table at these people who had rallied to her aid. Federal agents, university professors, attorneys, neighbors, and community members who barely knew her, but understood that her fight was really about something much larger than one woman's land dispute. We need to document everything, she said slowly, an idea forming. Not just the treasure and the historical evidence, but the pattern of intimidation and illegal activities. If the Montclair family has been using these tactics for decades, there must be other victims who would be willing to speak out. I can coordinate that effort, offered Sarah Tran, the agricultural community. The agricultural community is tight-knit. If families have been pressured into selling land under suspicious circumstances, word will travel. Dr. Laurent was making notes rapidly. From a legal standpoint, this could become a class action case involving property rights, environmental fraud, and possibly federal racketeering charges if we can prove a pattern of criminal activity. Santos nodded grimly. The federal government takes very seriously any attempts to defraud property owners or illegally extract archaeological treasures. If we can build a solid case, the full weight of federal law enforcement will come down on anyone involved in these activities.
As the meeting broke up and neighbors began heading home, Elena felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The day had transformed her from an isolated property owner fighting alone against powerful enemies into the center of a community effort that might finally hold the Montclair family accountable for centuries of crimes. But she also knew that the hardest battles lay ahead. Wealthy families with political connections didn't surrender easily, especially when hundreds of millions of dollars were at stake. The Montclairs had protected their secrets for 300 years. They wouldn't hesitate to escalate their tactics against anyone who threatened to expose the truth. That night, as Elena tucked Frafia into bed, her daughter asked the question that had been weighing on both their minds. "Mama, are we gonna be okay?" Elena considered how to answer honestly without frightening her daughter further. "We're going to fight for what's right, mija, and we're not fighting alone anymore." Outside, Tom Guidry and several other neighbors had volunteered to maintain watch throughout the night, ensuring that no more uninvited visitors would threaten the Vasquez family. Federal agents had positioned surveillance equipment around the property, and Dr. Laurent had filed emergency injunctions to prevent any further unauthorized activities on Elena's land. The poor rancher who'd been laughed at for buying worthless swampland had become the leader of a coalition that might finally bring justice to Vermillion Parish. But as Elena lay awake listening to the night sounds of rural Louisiana, she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dangers.
The treasure of the Esperanza del Sol waited beneath the waters of Devil's Hollow, its gold and silver representing not just wealth, but the power to transform an entire community's understanding of its own history. And somewhere on her ranch, another secret might be waiting to be uncovered, one that could provide the final proof needed to expose 3 centuries of carefully hidden crimes. The battle for truth and justice in Vermillion Parish was just beginning, and Elena Vasquez was determined to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena's transformation from desperate rancher to community leader was complete, but the real test of her courage and determination was yet to come. The Montclair family's next move would determine whether justice would finally be served or whether another generation would grow up under the shadow of secrets too powerful to challenge. 3 weeks after the failed excavation at Devil's Hollow, Elena stood in the federal courthouse in New Orleans, watching as teams of lawyers prepared for what local media had dubbed the trial of the century. The case had exploded into national news when leaked documents revealed the scope of the Montclair family's centuries-long conspiracy to conceal their criminal origins and manipulate Louisiana's political and economic systems. Dr. Sarah Tran approached Elena with the latest update from the archaeological team. The official excavation of the Esperanza del Sol began yesterday under federal oversight. The preliminary findings are extraordinary. The ship is almost perfectly preserved, and the treasure cones hold artifacts that will rewrite the history of Spanish colonial America. Elena nodded, but her attention was focused on the courtroom where Celeste Montclair sat with her legal team, her usual composed demeanor cracking under the weight of federal charges ranging from archaeological theft to racketeering. The past 3 weeks had seen a cascade of revelations that had shattered the Montclair family's carefully constructed mythology. The investigation of Elena's ranch well was the breakthrough that changed everything. Ground-penetrating radar had revealed not just a cache of Spanish gold and documents hidden by Elena Esperanza Valdez, but a complete archive of evidence documenting the original piracy, subsequent murders to silence witnesses, and 3 centuries of systematic criminal activity by the Montclair family. Miguel Santos emerged from a conference room where he'd been coordinating with federal prosecutors. "Elena, they're ready for your testimony. Remember, stick to the facts and don't let the defense attorneys intimidate you. You've got the strongest case in federal court history backing you up." As Elena took the witness stand, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her here. What had started as a desperate attempt to save her failing ranch had uncovered one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in North American history and exposed a criminal conspiracy that had shaped Louisiana politics for 3 centuries. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Chen, began with Elena's land purchase and the immediate pressure from the Montclair family. Elena described the anonymous threats, the illegal surveillance, and the fraudulent environmental emergency used to justify the unauthorized excavation. "Ms. Vasquez," Chen continued, "please tell the court what you discovered when federal investigators examined the well on your ranch property."
Elena took a deep breath. "We found a sealed chamber that had been hidden for almost 300 years. Inside were documents written by Elena Esperanza Valdez, the Spanish captain's daughter who survived the attack on the Esperanza del Sol. She had witnessed the murder of her father and the ship's crew by Pierre Montclair and his men." The courtroom was silent as Elena described the contents of Elena Valdez's hidden archive. Detailed accounts of the 1742 piracy, maps showing where additional treasure had been hidden, and most damaging of all, a complete list of witnesses who had been systematically murdered over the following decades to protect the Montclair secret. Elena Valdez spent her entire life collecting evidence, Elena continued. She documented how Pierre Montclair used the stolen Spanish gold to buy political influence, acquire vast landholdings, and establish the family dynasty that has controlled Vermillion Parish ever since. She also documented subsequent crimes, murders, land theft, political corruption, all funded by the original treasure. The defense attorney, an expensive lawyer from a prestigious New Orleans firm, attempted to discredit Elena's testimony by questioning her expertise and motivations, but when he suggested that she was simply a desperate rancher willing to say anything for money, Elena's response was devastating. "Sir, 3 weeks ago, the Montclair family offered me $50 million to walk away from this case and keep quiet about what I'd discovered. I turned them down because this isn't about money. It's about justice for everyone who's been harmed by their crimes over the past 3 centuries. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge called for order. The defense attorney looked stunned. The attempted bribe had not been previously disclosed and would likely result in additional federal charges. Dr. Rebecca Laurent took the stand next, providing expert testimony on maritime law and the legal implications of the Montclair family's actions. Her analysis was damning. Under both historical and contemporary law, the deliberate sinking of the Esperanza del Sol constituted an act of piracy, making any treasure recovered from it the proceeds of a violent crime. The Montclair family's wealth, accumulated over 3 centuries, is built entirely on the proceeds of murder and piracy, Dr. Laurent testified. Under federal asset forfeiture laws, this means that a substantial portion of their current holdings could be subject to seizure and redistribution to the victims of their crimes over the past 3 centuries. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by testimony from dozens of community members who had been victimized by Montclair business practices over the decades. Tom Guidry testified about the systematic pressure applied to small farmers facing financial difficulties. Sarah Tran, the rice farmer, described how her grandfather had been forced to sell his land for a fraction of its value after mysterious problems with his irrigation permits and bank loans. They would create the crisis and then offer the solution. Equipment failures, permit delays, sudden changes in loan terms, always followed by a generous offer to buy your land and solve all your problems. But the most dramatic moment came when Maria Boudreau took the stand. At 87 years old, she commanded immediate respect as she described the oral history that had been preserved by the Acadian families for nearly 3 centuries. My people knew the truth about what happened in 1742. We kept the stories alive because we believed that someday justice would be possible. Elena Vasquez made us promise to remember, to preserve the evidence, to wait for the right time to speak. Maria's testimony included details that perfectly corroborated the documents found in Elena's well, providing independent verification of the historical crimes. She also revealed that other Acadian families had been quietly documenting Montclair activities for generations, creating an extensive record of corruption and criminal behavior. The defense team's attempts to portray the case as a modern-day treasure hunt motivated by greed completely collapsed when the full scope of the evidence became clear. This wasn't just about archaeological artifacts. It was about a pattern of criminal behavior that had continued into the present day. Celeste Montclair finally took the stand in her own defense, but her testimony only made things worse. Under aggressive cross-examination, she revealed the family's sense of entitlement and complete lack of remorse for their actions. "My family built this parish," she declared defiantly. "We provided jobs, infrastructure, and economic stability for 3 centuries. If some difficult decisions had to be made along the way, that's the price of progress." When asked specifically about the murdered witnesses documented in Elena Vasquez's archive, Celeste's response was chilling. "Those people died almost 300 years ago. Whatever happened then has no bearing on our family's contributions to modern Louisiana." The prosecutor pressed further. "Miss Montclair, are you denying that your family knew about the original piracy and murders?" Celeste hesitated, realizing she had been trapped. Family stories and historical facts are different things. We've always been proud of our ancestors' entrepreneurial spirit.
Entrepreneurial spirit? The prosecutor repeated incredulously. You're describing the systematic murder of dozens of people to cover up an act of piracy. Celeste's composure finally cracked. They were Spanish colonists and Acadian peasants. They would have wasted the treasure on churches and small farms. My family used that gold to build something lasting, something that benefited everyone in the parish. The courtroom was stunned by this admission. Celeste had essentially confessed to her family's knowledge of the crimes while attempting to justify them. Her legal team was frantically signaling for her to stop talking, but the damage was done. During closing arguments,
the prosecution painted a devastating picture of 3 centuries of criminal activity enabled by wealth stolen from a Spanish treasure ship. The defense's attempt to portray the Montclairs as victims of historical prejudice fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all federal charges. Celeste Montclair was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that would effectively bankrupt the family dynasty. More importantly, the court ordered the forfeiture of all assets that could be traced to the original stolen treasure, which, according to federal financial investigators, included virtually everything the family owned. But the legal victory was only the beginning of Elena's story. The real transformation came in the months that followed, as Vermillion Parish began to rebuild itself around principles of justice and community cooperation rather than the exploitation that had defined it for centuries. The treasure recovered from the Esperanza del Sol was valued at over $300 million after authentication and historical analysis. Under the court's restitution order, this wealth was distributed among the documented victims of Montclair crimes, with Elena receiving the largest share as the property owner who had exposed the conspiracy. Elena used her portion to establish the Vermillion Agricultural Cooperative, providing low-interest loans and technical support to small farmers throughout the parish. The cooperative also purchased much of the former Montclair landholdings, redistributing them to families whose ancestors had been forced off their property through fraudulent means. Sophia, now 11 years old, often accompanied her mother to the cooperative's offices, watching as families who had struggled for generations finally gained access to the resources they needed to prosper. Elena was proud that her daughter was growing up in a community where success came from hard work and mutual support, rather than exploitation and intimidation. Carmen had lived to see justice finally served, though she passed away peacefully the following winter, surrounded by family and friends in the comfortable new home Elena had built on their expanded ranch. Her final words to Elena were a reminder that spoke to the heart of their incredible journey. Sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that bring people together rather than driving them apart. Dr. Sarah Tran had been appointed as the director of the Esperanza del Sol Maritime Archaeological Site, which had become a world-renowned research center and museum. The ship itself remained in its underwater resting place, protected by federal law and accessible to researchers and visitors through carefully managed diving programs. The archaeological discoveries continued to yield new insights into Spanish colonial history, Native American cultures, and the complex relationships between European powers in the early 18th century. Elena often visited the site, marveling at how her desperate gamble on worthless swampland had led to discoveries that were reshaping academic understanding of American history. Dr. Rebecca Laurent had established a new legal practice specializing in historical justice cases, using the Montclair precedent to pursue similar investigations across the American South. Her work had already resulted in several significant cases involving families whose wealth could be traced to slavery, land theft, and other historical crimes. Miguel Santos had been promoted within the federal government and now headed a new task force investigating archaeological crimes and historical fraud. The Esperanza del Sol case had demonstrated the need for better coordination between federal agencies when dealing with complex cases involving multiple jurisdictions and centuries-old evidence. Maria Boudreau had become something of a celebrity, invited to speak at universities and historical conferences about the importance of preserving oral history and the role of marginalized communities in documenting truth. At 88, she remained sharp and passionate about ensuring that the lessons of the Montclair case were not forgotten. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in Vermillion Parish itself. The removal of the Montclair family's political and economic dominance had created space for new leadership and new approaches to community development. Elena found herself serving on the parish council,
helping to draft new policies that prioritized environmental protection, agricultural sustainability, and economic justice. The parish had also established the Elena Vasquez Memorial Foundation, honoring the Spanish survivor who had preserved the evidence of 18th-century crimes for future generations. The foundation provided scholarships for young people from farming families, ensuring that future generations would have opportunities that had been denied to their ancestors.
10 years had passed since Elena Vasquez first stood at the auction grounds of Vermillion Parish, desperate and alone, bidding on worthless swampland with her last $35,000. Now, as she walked through the halls of the Louisiana state capitol in Baton Rouge, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that the most impossible dreams sometimes require only the courage to take the first step. Elena was in the Capitol to testify before the state legislature about a bill that would fundamentally change how Louisiana handled historical discoveries and historical justice cases. The Esperanza del Sol Act, as it had come to be known, would create a streamlined process for investigating and prosecuting crimes involving historical fraud, stolen cultural artifacts, and the systematic theft of family properties through falsified documents. "Representative Vasquez," called out Senator Robert LeBlanc as Elena approached the committee room. The title still felt strange after 2 years in the state legislature, but Elena had learned to embrace the platform it gave her to advocate for rural communities and historical justice. "Senator LeBlanc," Elena replied with a warm smile, "are you ready to make some history today? After everything you've accomplished, I don't think anyone doubts your ability to change the world," he replied. "How is Sophia adjusting to LSU?" Elena's face brightened with pride. "She's thriving. Double major in maritime archaeology and environmental law. She says she wants to follow in her mother's footsteps, but do it with proper legal training from the start." Sophia was now 21, a senior at Louisiana State University who had become something of a celebrity in academic circles for her research on Spanish colonial artifacts recovered from the Esperanza del Sol. Her thesis project involved using advanced DNA analysis to identify the remains of crew members found on the ship, providing closure to families across Spain and Latin America who had wondered for centuries about their missing ancestors. The committee hearing room was packed with representatives from historical societies, Native American tribes, environmental groups, and rural communities from across Louisiana. Elena's legislation had drawn support from an unlikely coalition of interests, all united by the recognition that historical injustices continued to impact contemporary communities. Elena took her place at the witness table, looking out at an audience that included many familiar faces. Dr. Sarah Tron sat in the front row, now director of the Louisiana Maritime Archaeological Institute. Beside her was Dr. Rebecca Laurent, whose legal practice had expanded nationwide as other states began investigating their own histories of systematic fraud and stolen wealth. Maria Boudreau, now 93 years old but still sharp as ever, occupied a place of honor in the front row. She had become the unofficial historian of the Esperanza del Sol case, traveling to schools and universities to share the story of how ordinary people had preserved truth across centuries until the moment was right for justice to prevail. "Madam Chairman, members of the committee," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. 10 years ago, I was a struggling rancher who bought what everyone considered worthless swampland because I was desperate and out of options. Today, I stand before you as living proof that sometimes our greatest discoveries come from our most desperate moments. Elena outlined how the Esperanza del Sol case had revealed the need for better legal frameworks to address historical crimes and their contemporary impacts. She described families across Louisiana who had been systematically defrauded of their property over generations, and how current laws made it nearly impossible to seek justice for crimes that had been concealed for decades or centuries. The treasure we recovered from Devil's Hollow wasn't just gold and silver. It was the truth about how certain families built their wealth through violence and fraud, and how that stolen wealth continued to shape our communities for 3 centuries. But more importantly, it showed us that when communities come together to seek justice, no conspiracy is too powerful to be exposed. The committee members asked detailed questions about the proposed legislation, focusing particularly on how it would balance the rights of current property owners with the need to investigate historical crimes. Elena had anticipated these concerns and worked with legal experts to develop a framework that protected innocent purchasers while providing remedies for documented fraud. Senator Martinez, Elena addressed one skeptical committee member, I understand your concerns about retroactive justice and property rights, but consider this. The Montclair family maintained their ill-gotten wealth for 3 centuries by ensuring that their victims never had legal recourse. This legislation simply creates a process for investigating cases where there's credible evidence of systematic fraud, with appropriate safeguards for all parties involved. The hearing lasted 4 hours, with testimony from historians, legal experts, and community representatives from across Louisiana. Elena's legislation had drawn support from an unlikely coalition of interests, all united by the recognition that historical injustices continued to impact contemporary communities. After the hearing, Elena drove to Devil's Hollow for her monthly visit to the archaeological site. The location had been transformed into a world-class research facility and museum, drawing thousands of visitors annually to learn about Spanish colonial history and the importance of historical preservation.
The boardwalk that now provided access to the site was lined with interpretive panels telling the story of the Esperanza del Sol, the 1742 piracy, and the subsequent centuries-long cover-up. Visitors could take guided tours of the underwater excavation site, view artifacts in the climate-controlled museum, and learn about ongoing research projects. Elena's favorite spot was the memorial garden dedicated to Elena Esperanza Valdez, the Spanish survivor whose courage and foresight had made ultimate justice possible. A bronze statue depicted a young woman placing documents in a sealed container, preserving truth for future generations who would have the power to act on it. Dr. Tran emerged from the research building as Elena approached, carrying a folder filled with the latest findings from the ongoing excavation. "Elena, perfect timing," Dr. Tran called out. "We've made another significant discovery. The ship's navigation room contained a collection of maps and charts that are revolutionizing our understanding of 18th century Caribbean trade routes." Elena had remained deeply involved with the archaeological project, serving on the board that oversaw research priorities and community engagement. She took particular pride in ensuring that local students had opportunities to participate in the research, creating pathways for young people from rural Louisiana to pursue careers in archaeology, history, and related fields. "Any word from the Spanish government about the repatriation discussions?" Elena asked. "Actually, yes," Dr. Tran replied with excitement. "They've agreed to a partnership arrangement where the most significant artifacts will be shared between museums in Spain and Louisiana. It's an unprecedented agreement that recognizes both the historical importance of the site and the role that our community played in preserving it." Elena nodded with satisfaction. From the beginning, she had insisted that the treasure and artifacts be treated as cultural heritage rather than personal wealth. While she had received substantial compensation as the property owner who exposed the conspiracy, the bulk of the treasure's value had been used to establish educational and cultural programs that would benefit future generations. As they walked through the site, Elena reflected on the changes that had swept through Vermillion Parish over the past decade. The removal of the Montclair family's economic dominance had created space for new industries and approaches to development. The parish now boasted thriving ecotourism, sustainable agriculture, and artisanal food production sectors that provided good-paying jobs while respecting the area's environmental and cultural heritage. The Vermillion Agricultural Cooperative that Elena had established with her portion of the treasure had become a model for rural economic development, copied by communities across the South.
It provided low-interest loans, technical assistance, and marketing support to small farmers, enabling them to compete effectively with large agribusiness operations. Elena's own ranch had expanded to include educational programs where urban students could learn about sustainable agriculture and environmental stewardship. Sophia often brought her university classmates to help with research projects that combined archaeological investigation with modern farming techniques. Carmen's memory was honored throughout the parish through the Carmen Vasquez Community Center, which provided everything from after-school programs to senior services. Elena often visited the center, remembering her mother's wisdom about how the most valuable treasures were the ones that brought people together. As the sun began to set over Devil's Hollow, Elena made her way to the small dock where researchers launched their daily underwater surveys. The water was clear now, its murky appearance from a decade ago having been the result of sediment stirred up by illegal excavation attempts. Fish jumped regularly, and the ecosystem had recovered dramatically once the area came under federal protection. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. "Mom, just got accepted to the graduate program at Oxford, going to study under Dr. Henderson, the world's leading expert on colonial maritime archaeology. Think I'm ready to carry on the family tradition of making impossible discoveries?" Elena smiled as she typed back, "I think you've been ready since the day you watched your mother challenge the most powerful family in Louisiana and win. The world needs more people willing to dig for truth, even when everyone says it's impossible to find." As darkness settled over the Louisiana wetlands, Elena stood at the edge of the water where the Esperanza del Sol rested in its honored grave. Lights from the research station reflected off the dark surface, creating patterns that seemed to dance with the gentle current. 10 years ago, Elena Vasquez was a desperate woman facing foreclosure, mocked by her community for making what appeared to be the worst investment decision in parish history. Tonight, she was a state representative, successful businesswoman, and community leader whose courage had transformed not just her own life, but the entire understanding of how justice could be achieved even across centuries of concealment.
The poor rancher who had been laughed at for buying worthless swampland had learned that sometimes the most desperate gambles lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. But more than that, she had learned that when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, even the most powerful conspiracies can be exposed and defeated. Elena often thought about the moment when she had first heard the metal detector's urgent beeping in the shallow water of Devil's Hollow. That sound had marked the beginning of a journey that revealed 3 centuries of hidden truth and created opportunities for justice that had seemed impossible just a few years earlier. As she walked back to her truck, Elena passed the historical marker that had been installed to commemorate the site. Here lies the Spanish treasure ship Esperanza del Sol, lost in 1742 and recovered in 2024 through the courage of those who refused to let truth remain buried. May this site remind future generations that justice, like treasure, is always worth seeking, no matter how long it takes or how deep you have to dig. The inscription concluded with a quote from Elena herself. "Sometimes the most valuable discoveries are made by people who have nothing left to lose and everything to fight for."